Welcome to the Lightforge. This is Adwukta.
This is Merps. Hope you guys are having a good week. Hope your arenas are going well. Let's chat. Nothing incredibly new has happened. Same old meta, right?
Kind of weird, right? Blizzard for the first time hasn't come out with a balancing patch, like a rebucketing patch for the arena within literally within like a week after the release. It's now been more than 2 weeks, I think. And we still don't have a rebucketing patch yet, right? Giggly Inventor is still bucket number 3.
Yeah, nothing has changed. Giggly Inventor is still one of the boogeymen in the arena. A lot of people are calling for it to be properly bucketed. We'll see what happens. But Blizzard, I don't know, still no word. You know, if there's any changes, your guess is as good as ours when they're going to come.
Yeah. So until that happens, there's not really anything different in the arena now than there was 2 weeks ago or 1 week ago, and that's good, right? Like I think we said last week. At least I think it's literally the best arena meta we have ever had, including like really old school metas. There's always been something a little bit wrong with the arena, and it's not like it's perfect now, but it is quite a noticeable step up from where it's been in the recent past, and also from where it's been in the far back past when arena was still wild. So it's a good time, and it's a very fundamentals based arena. We keep talking about fundamentals and why that's one of the reasons why we like this meta. And I think rather than go into why this meta is good in particular, let's just look at what this meta is, right? That's why today's deep fried meta is what we're going to spend most of our time on. And we're going back to the fundamentals here. This is something where if you've been listening to us for like 3 years, you know, because it's not anything groundbreaking. It's not anything you haven't heard before. But if you haven't been listening to us for 3 years, maybe you've only listened to us for like 1 year, we may have talked about this not so much. Just because it hasn't been as big a part of what it takes to win. It's always a big part of what it takes to win, but it hasn't been like a highlight until now. But it is really like this is what the arena is about at the fundamental basis, and that is getting onto the board and kind of like tempo generally.
Right, because I think it's a good time to talk about it for two reasons. Number one, we throw around a lot of these ideas, but it's hard for a lot of people to be like, okay, well, you say X, but what exactly is X and how do you do X, right? It's one thing to like talk about it and throw terms around, but it's another thing to break it down and say, here's how you implement it. And number two, we like the meta. I think a number of people like the meta, but we've also had a lot of people say, hey, I'm having trouble with this meta.
Mm-hmm.
My wins are down and I'm doing something wrong.
And I used to be pretty good in this meta.
Right.
And like in the prior meta. And what that tells me is you were pretty good at something that was not what was traditionally the arena, and instead you became good at something, or you were not even playing back in the old days in the arena. And you're good at this other thing that Blizzard's kind of tilted the arena towards. And now that Blizzard swung it back to fundamentals, you realize you're not really that great at the fundamental parts of Hearthstone. So this is a good time to bone up on the fundamentals. In this meta, as in any meta that's based on like very heavily on the fundamentals, here's what will win you most of your games. I don't mean 50% of your games. I want to say like 65-70% of your games. You will win by doing this one thing, or rather one of two things.
Arena players hate it. 10 things that you can do to improve your win rate.
2 things actually. So okay, first thing is you want to be 4 mana ahead in tempo, or 8 stats ahead in tempo. Each tempo in mana in Hearthstone is approximately 1 mana, which is approximately 2 stat points. They can be 2 attack points, 2 health points. Obviously, if you skew one way or the other, you're either not as effective. Like if you have too much health and not a lot of attack, you're not doing much. That's not good. If you have too much attack, not a lot of health, it's very good unless your opponent has any kind of removal whatsoever. And then it's not so good because you're going to lose a lot of stats for a very cheap removal, and you can get swung back really quickly. But generally, if you're playing mostly even statted minions, you want to be 4 tempo ahead or 8 stats ahead. And or you want to be 2 cards ahead of your opponent. So usually you count the player who hasn't gone yet as having a half card, because they're going to draw one whole card when they take their turn. So with that as understanding, and obviously not counting the coin as cards, you want to try to get one or the other. If you have a 2-card advantage, you're generally not going to lose the card advantage game. I'm not saying you won't, right? This is like you're going to win 70% of the time. That means you lose 30% of the time. And it doesn't mean like, oh, I stopped trying now that I have this lead. I just kind of like nurse my lead and then I'll win. No, if you keep nursing your lead, you'll win 70% of the time. Now, that's not bad, but you could probably improve on that by doing even better. But this is the fundamental, right? Like, if you just do this, you will get like a 70% win rate, or like a little less than 70%. You gotta take out the situations in which you can't possibly do this. So maybe like a 65% win rate or something, which is pretty good. Like, that'll get you what, like more than 5 wins per run, definitely, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. And so this is just the fundamental. Okay. So first things first, how do you get that, right? Like, how do you get this little edge on the arena? It used to be that you can swing like 8 tempo without too much difficulty. And so these little advantages don't mean as much, and it means more how much value and how many of those big swing cards you get. Now, that's not really as much of a thing. So, we're going to break this down into 3 parts of kind of like the fundamentals of tempo. And I won't throw too many numbers out at you guys, and I won't go too deep. I know there's some questions about, like, I think I mentioned sub-tempo, like subcategories of tempo last time, and some people were like, I've been listening to you for 4 years. What is this sub-tempo thing? Sub-tempo is going to win you the game less than 1% of the time, like an understanding of it. So we're not talking about it. It's really much more for like game design and for constructed even than it is for the arena. But this is just normal meat and potatoes tempo. Step 1, how to curvestone. You don't have to curvestone, but you should understand how it works so you know what's happening when it happens. 2, how to tempo without a good curve, meaning how you get your tempo if you're not curvestoning, whether because you didn't draft your deck like that, or because, well, let's face it, we all miss 2 drops. 3, how to deal with slowly losing the board. No matter how good you are, you're sometimes going to get screwed. Sometimes your opponent just tempos out really, really, really well, and you're just not going to be able to get the board. But there's a difference between losing the board in a good way and losing the board in a bad way. And so we're gonna try to cover all 3 of these. And these are all, again, pretty basic. If you're like a 7-win player and you're like, oh, I already know all this, or I think there are some nuances here you're not covering, you're right. You probably already know it, and we're not covering all the nuances. But you got to start somewhere, right? So, okay. So step 1, how to curvestone. Merps, what is curvestone? What does that mean in an arena setting?
Okay, well, there's the derogatory kind of like curvestone, but generally when we talk about curvestone, I think an easy way to lay it out is just the fact that you want to curve out and you want to use your mana. So on turn 1, you play 1 drop. Turn 2, play 2 drop. Turn 3, play 3 drop. Or if you have the coin, you can go 2-2-3 or 1-3-3, something like that. It just means you are placing somewhat equal, or you're basically every single turn you're turning your mana into its equivalent value in tempo, or at least you're trying to do that every single turn with the mana that you have. That's curvestone.
So it's 2 parts, right? First part, spend all your mana. Second part, the things you spend your mana on have to be things that are on the board. So you're trying to turn your mana into stats. So if you're spending all your mana on like hallucinations and like arcane intellects, you're not curvestoning. You may be using every single mana, but you're not impacting the board at all. That's basic curvestone. A little bit more of the curvestone flavor is the idea that every turn, you and your opponent get 1 more mana. So the curve is always escalating. And until it gets to the point where it's reasonable for both players to expect each other to play 2 cards per turn instead of 1 card, your next card is always going to be a little bit higher than that. So if I play a Croc, and then you play a Amalgam, well, now your Amalgam is going to end up being a 3-2, and my Croc is dead. And then I play a Yeti, and your Amalgam is going to end up dead, and my Yeti is going to be a 4-2. And then you play, I don't know, let's say, I guess Pit Fighter is what I keep wanting to say, even though Pit Fighter doesn't exist anymore. So you play a 5-6, like on curve minion, and then my Yeti's going to be dead, and you're going to have a 5-2. And it goes back and forth, right? I have a 3-2, you have a 4-2, 5-2, you have a 6. until it gets to the point where the things get more. So the game is set up for this back and forth. It's not particularly interesting. It's actually one of the most boring kinds of gameplay you can possibly do outside of you play a 3-3, I play a 3-3, you play a 4-4, our 3-3's trade, I play a 4-4. So when Hearthstone's set up, they set it up specifically so that even in the arena, you don't end up with the 3-3 on 3-3, 4-4 on 4-4 actions. That's why you have some stat diversity to kind of force this. But it doesn't get rid of the idea that it's escalating. Every step, the next person that curves out is at an advantage. At any step that you don't curve out, you lose the curves game. You're just behind on tempo. That's it. So in the derogatory form of curvestone, what that means is whoever misses their first curve turn loses the entire game. That's not very fun, and it's not very skillful because you usually I say it's not very skillful. It's actually probably if you curve out and your opponent should curve out, your opponent still won't curve out more than half the time. Especially on the 0-0 games. So I don't know if it's a lot of skill to play curvestone, but the majority of the people don't know how to play curvestone. They may use the term derogatorily as in, oh, this is no skill, but they have no idea how to do it, even though it's probably one of the easiest things you can do. Put most stats on board always, use all mana. It's simple enough.
Yep.
Okay, so if the thing to know about curvestone is not that you have to play curvestone. This is not a meta like GVG in which curvestone wins. It doesn't always. It can swing a little bit harder than that. I think Blizzard finally got the swing right, where it's not just curvestone, but in which good trading on the board matters. But you have to recognize what your opponent is always trying to do next. And at the basics, if you have no other read on your opponent, you should assume your opponent always has the option to curvestone. So on their turn 3, they play a 3-4. On their turn 4, they play a 4-5 or a 5-4, right? And you have to be ready for both instances of the cards that they're playing. You have to be ready for a 5-4, you have to be ready for a 4-5, on turn 5, you have to be ready for a 5-6 or a 6-5. It doesn't matter if those cards don't exist in the game, right? There's no 5-6 in the game, there's no 6-5 in the game that's neutral, but just be prepared for it. Because when you're in a minion-based meta, the way things are right now, you have no initiative, which means you have to anticipate your opponent's next move always. Before you can use any amount of brain power to outwit your opponent, you have to have some reasonable idea of what your opponent's reasonable options are. And curvestone is your I have no read basic. Because if your opponent curves out, they're playing curvestone. That may not be their only plan, but it's one of their plans. And it should be one of your plans too. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of curvestone, and you can kind of see how if someone misses a turn, they're in a pretty bad spot, and otherwise they're in a pretty good spot because it keeps escalating. So let's move on to the part that actually takes a bit more skill, and that is how to tempo without a good curve. So let's say your opponent's curvestoning, you're curvestoning, and you miss a curve turn, right? You have to play something. You play something subpar. It's turn 3, you have to play a 2-2 because it's all you got. Your opponent keeps curving out. Now you're a little behind. So what do you do after that?
Just generally?
Yeah, I mean, I'm falling behind on the board a little bit. I'm not completely dead. I haven't skipped my turn 4 or something drastic. But I need a little bit of help. Or even if I don't need a little bit of help, even if I'm just deciding between 2 on-curve cards to play on turn 3, which one do I pick? What do I do?
So this is the point where you guys have to use your brains, right? What Advocate said before is curvestone is not too hard to play. And it's correct. Basically, if you are putting out the maximum amount of tempo every turn, you're not missing anything, you're kind of just gonna fall into some good results just by doing that. But if you fall behind, right? If it's turn 3 and all you can do is play that 2-2, there's a good chance they are playing the 3-4, right? Or 4-4, maybe. So what you have to do afterwards is on the next turn, you just have to evaluate. Okay, well, they are getting, let's say, the free, 3-2 out of it or 4-2 out of it. So it's well, what can I do? It's if you have a choice between a Yeti or, let's say, a Stegodon, right? you're like, oh, okay, well, the Stegodon is actually like much safer here, right? And you know, you might not have the choice. You might have to play the Yeti, or you know, one extreme example would be like Shroom Brewer. You obviously don't want to play that, but the Stegodon is really good. So one option is just like, okay, well, look at your minions and see which one is better for the board state now. Or if you have like an AoE in the hand, and like, AoE is also tempo, right? Like it gets rid of tempo. It is a huge tempo play. A lot of people also just tend to think of tempo as like, oh, it's me putting minions. But tempo goes both ways. You taking off tempo is your gain in tempo as well. Like minus tempo for your opponent is gaining tempo for you, essentially. So if you are trying to set up for an AoE, you know, and you're behind, you might think, okay, well, I need to hit this AoE. What minions help me most? Maybe you have like a Mogushan Warden at that point. You're like, actually, this is pretty good setup for my Holy Nova, right? So maybe you just play the
Well,
Mogushan
now we're
Warden.
skipping a little ahead to how to deal with slowly losing the board. So let's say we're still fighting for the board here. We haven't given up. So that's what you do when you've given up on the board, right? Like sometimes you fall so far behind. It's turn 4, you can only play a 2-2. You're going to lose the board, right? If you don't have the board. You're just like trading minions up until that point. But before that step, you may be a little bit behind in tempo. Maybe your opponent's playing a 3-4 and you're only playing a 2-4, or your opponent's playing the Yetis and you're playing the 4-4s, and you realize that you're falling behind on the tempo. You can always give up, like what Merps is talking about, like intelligently give up the board so that you may retake it later. But something else that you can do is to try to match your tempo, like Merps was talking about with the Stegodon, right? You don't need more stats to win the board. If you always needed more stats to win the board, if it was like a game of war, you know, that card game War where you just flip over the top card of each of your decks and whoever has the highest number wins, if that's how curvestone actually worked, there would be no thought to it. But that's not how it actually works. That's why we have attack and we have defense. So if your opponent eats something of yours and has a 3-2 out, and you know, your option is to play a 3-3 or a 2-4, you'd obviously play the 2-4, right? You can go one step before that, where let's say you were going to fall behind on turn 3 because you don't have an on-curve play. You could play a 3-1 that draws you a card, or you can play like a 1-1 that draws you a card, and then also, you know, sneak in a hallucination or something else you have to use your mana for. We'll evaluate how the board is going to look, and evaluate how you're going to mop up after it the very next turn with your very next minion. So if the 3-1 puts your opponent's 3-4 down to 3-1, and that matters because you have a Stegodon, then great, you got to play that. You can't play the 1-1. Even if the 3-1 doesn't draw a card, even if the 3-1 was like a Cult Master, right? And you'd like really, really, really want to get its actual ability to trigger, you got to just play it for tempo, because otherwise you're going to lose the board. On the other hand, if all you have is a Yeti on turn 4, then it doesn't matter, right? Then you play your 1-1 that draws a card, and you're in the same exact spot as if you played the 3-1, and your opponent has a 3-4 that eats it. I'm assuming no hero powers. So you got to make these determinations of when you can take some value, and when you can, and when you have to keep, like, kind of 100% playing tempo regardless of all the value you're going. So that's very, very important when you don't have the best curve option going ahead and you're fighting for the board. Because remember what we said about how to win this game. You can win the game if you end up with 4 mana's worth of tempo. Or you can win the game if you end up with 2 cards or more. So if you're not going to get the tempo part, you're eventually going to need to either stall the game to the point in which your cards get you tempo. Remember, once your opponent starts running out of cards, they don't have to literally run out of cards, but they have 2 cards left. Their options are low enough that they're going to start missing tempo, right? If you have 2 cards left at 8 mana, what are the odds they actually add up to 8 mana? Not a lot. You're probably going to start hanging some mana. And that's when you, with the extra cards and extra options, actually win the tempo game. So I say 2 cards, but 2 cards really translates to a whole bunch of tempo later on. That's all cards are. Cards are late game tempo. Like, people think in terms of card advantage, but unless you're doing a combo deck in which the options actually mean something too, all card advantage is really, really, really late tempo, which is why it's not usually terribly important. But if that's your win condition because your opponent took the early game tempo, then that's your win condition. Make sure you have it, right? Like, make sure you're not sacrificing everything to fight like this, like, very questionable board state that's happening there. And on the other hand, don't give up the board state if you can still fight it. So this is the decision making process. You have to keep both of your goals in mind. Now, having cards doesn't do anything until you get to that late game. But keep in mind, you will be able to get to the late game as long as you don't die. So if you have board clears, if your opponent draws cards, like sometimes people are like, oh, I don't have any like comeback cards. You don't need comeback cards to get to the late game. If your opponent ever like draws cards or does anything anti-tempo, you're back on the board, right? Like you may have missed your curvestone moment here, but you don't fully give up. You start setting up an alternate win condition while fighting the board because your opponent's not going to 100% tempo the entire way through, unless he's like really lucky, in which case, fine, you never stood a chance at this game. It's going to happen. It doesn't matter how much non-curvestone you make the game, that's going to happen sometimes. You're playing a card game. But it happens very rarely that your opponent, I would say probably maybe once every 20 games, it happens that your opponent is out so fast that a normally like constructed deck is not able to like at least like make a play for. Okay, so that is how to tempo without a good curve. And I want to stress the idea that they're minions, right? You're playing minions, and if you're playing minions, that means you need to predict your opponent's next move. Something else I see that happens a lot is people keep asking me this question. It's like, why play the 3-2 over the 2-3 or the 2-3 over the 3-2? And I don't even think about it too much anymore because it's like so ingrained, but you play the 3-2 if it can be matched up against your opponent's 3-drop next. You play the 2-3 in every other circumstance. Because the 2-3 is less easy to be removed, and if your opponent's not playing their 3-drop next, that means they're playing their 2-drop next, which means their 2-3 can trade with everything anyway, and can eat 2-2s where your 3-2s can't. So it's just 100% advantage. The only time your opponent can get an advantage out of you playing a 2-3 over a 3-2 is if your opponent skips the turn to do something else. In which case, you don't care because you're already ahead on them, right? Like, if you're thinking about ways that you can be countered, don't worry about the ways in which you win the game anyway, right? Like, this is something that we harp on a lot, which is a lot of things can happen, but anything that doesn't help you win the game more, or anything that would result you in losing the game regardless, are not possibilities. It doesn't matter if it's 99% certain to happen, whether because you're the most unlucky bastard in the world, or because, you know, you have a good read on your opponent. If it's a 100% loss or 100% win regardless, then your decision doesn't matter, and so that factor doesn't go into your decision. Okay, so anyway, so if my opponent has a coin and it's my turn 2 and my opponent didn't do anything on turn 1, that means they have 3 mana the next turn potentially, which means if I play a raptor, he needs a 2-4 or a 3-4, which is like less than half of the 3-drops available. On the other hand, if I play a croc, he can play any 3-drop, and I'm screwed, right? So the 3-2 is much better than the 2-3 in that instance. And it's thinking like this that goes on every step of what people call like curvestone, right? Like, it's not the most difficult thought process, but you have to be thinking always about what your opponent is going to play next. And especially when you're a little bit behind, you have to look at what your next plays are to determine how you set up so that you can come back onto the board. Because you have your choices, right? You can make your opponents have a difficult time taking the board, or you can kind of like roll over and let them have the board and take like some other, like try to like win in some other kind of. It's always easier to win on the board, because if you're on the board, every one of your minions that survives has initiative the next turn. It's like getting free removal. Getting free removals wins you the game. So definitely always try to fight for the board.
Yes. I have nothing to add. I mean, what you were saying all is like correct, and it's stuff that we've said like for weeks and weeks. And if you watch the stream, right? It's just like a lot of people think of minions and spells as completely different, but you've categorized it before. It's like minions are kind of just like delayed spells sometimes, right? It's
in Magic the Gathering, minions are called spells. In the OG, the original card game that has this kind of like attack, defense, whatever format that Hearthstone uses and borrows heavily from, minions are just spells. So, like, definitely don't think of minions as like, I mean, okay, they're kind of gimp spells, right? Because they're like very, very delayed. But if you've ever thought of like, oh, when I have a weapon, it's very nice because the next charge, like the next turn, I still get like another hit off of it. That's what minions are. It's the second and third hits of your weapon. Like they're not useless. And you plotting out where they'll be if you have a good read on your opponent, or if you just have good expectations of what your opponents can do, helps you get ahead. Like I watch some people like play, and I hear this and I see this, and just people lose the board in the first like 3-4 turns, and they don't know why. And half the time there's nothing they could have done about it, but the other half of the time there's a reason why we end up with the board more often than other people. Like other people, as in like people who average like 3 wins per run. And it's not a difficult thing to do, but it is something you actually have to do. Like, it's not like you don't have decisions to make. It's not that we just get really lucky, like 25% of the time more than other people. It's because we're anticipating our opponent's next move better. And I wouldn't say it's a hard thing to do, but if you have some experience in the arena, you should be like playing with that in mind. Every time you see an opponent play a 3-drop, you know that's a possibility that your opponent does on turn 3. Every time you play a 3-drop, you know that's a possibility that your opponent can do that on turn 3, because you're all in the arena, right? You're using the same pool. Okay, so now we go to immersive was starting to talk about before, which is how to deal with losing the board. No matter how high your percentage chance is to start on the board, because you've taken our tips, you've drafted a curve that exists, you're playing in an up-tempo way for the most part, you may not have you may not have the board. You may actually have to give up the board. And if it's turn 3 and you play a 2/2, that does not mean you have to give up the board. But if it's like turn 4 and you skip your turn at hero power, and it's not a terribly meaningful hero power, you've probably given up the board. There's you'll get a better sense of this as you play more with an eye out to it. But you should know at the point in which you just don't have the board, and your opponent will at least have the board for a little bit. And so the way I like to think about it is not that, oh, I'm about to lose the board now. It's, oh, I'm about to lend my opponent the board for a little bit. Because I have to. Like, I'm being forced to. But I'm going to get the board back at some point. Because if I don't get the board back, I lose. And again, things that guarantee losses and things that guarantee wins are not considered in your thought process. Because they don't matter. Because they don't affect your decision making at all. So, in my mind, whenever I lose the board, I always get the board. Because it's impossible to win without the board if I lose the board on turn 4, right? I have to be on the board at least sometime, right? Maybe if I get on the board again, deal enough damage, and then lose the board, I can get some reach and finish off the game. But not on turn 4. So that's where you start thinking, well, if I'm going to get the board back, let's work backwards. In what scenario does my story end with me getting the board back? Well, here are the cards that are swing cards, like talking about, here's the Flame Strike, here's the Shadow Madness, here's whatever, but also, more importantly, what's in your hand. Even things that seem like they're not exactly the biggest swing cards, they're your options for getting the board back. Let's say you have a Frostbolt, right? What's a way you can get your board back? Well, if your opponent plays a 6/3, your Frostbolt gets 2 tempo back. That's a lot. And if that's the case, if you have a Frostbolt in your hand, you do want to play as much tempo on the board as possible. When your opponent plays is like 5/6, your Raptor can hit into the 5/6 with your Frostbolt, and that matters. If on the other hand, all you're holding in your hand are like saps and assassinates, that Raptor may not do all that much. Right? Especially if you're playing something even worse than a Raptor, like even less challenging, like a 2/1 or something. Like, is that important? I don't know. If you're setting up for a Psychic Scream, like, definitely don't do it. You're just throwing cards away. So you have to figure out what your comeback mechanisms are, and then you have to use your minions to set up for it. Because the other thing I see a lot is like people just are like, oh, I've lost the board, let me wait until I get saved by my big cards. And it's like, well, you're dying quicker. Like, you should at least play some cards. Even if you're just kind of throwing cards away, just treat your cards as taunts, right? As heals. Like, if I put a Yeti out there and it gets like fully eaten and it doesn't help me trade at all in any way, shape, or form because I'm waiting on my Twisting Nether, maybe I even already have my Twisting Nether in my hand, Well, if it took them 6 damage to kill your Yeti, you've saved 6 health.
Yeah, we've done this quite a few times, and the Yeti provides a few bonuses, not just healing your face, right? It's like the less you do on your end, the more cautious they are as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you dropping the Yeti out there, it's not only let's say 4 mana to heal,
6.
let's say heal 6,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like you overheal by a little bit. 4 mana heal 6, and with like sort of like a subtext, it's like make your opponent less likely to suspect the twisting nether.
Mm-hmm.
So that's always good as well. Because I've had people on the other end absolutely do nothing on turn 6, I'm like, all right, well, I'm not doing anything. Or I'm like, okay, now's the time where I just play my mechanical whelp,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or I'm like, I play a loot hoarder and I hero power, something like that. That is it. So in that instance, you play the Yeti, you gain a little bit of health, which you need anyways, and you hope that they reward your sacrifice by pushing more into your giant clear.
Yep. That's definitely a thing. You don't want to tip your opponent off, especially if that's your comeback, right? It's not a comeback if you do a 1 for 2. That's just a good trade. So, yeah. And again, the setup oftentimes, so this is the absolute comeback, right? The absolute board flip, the kind of thing that was like seen doubly before 12.0, before Booms. The more smaller comebacks in which, oh, your opponent just like on turn 9 plays 6 mana of stuff, and you play 9 mana of stuff and make a good trade in there, and so you swing 5 tempo. Like what I just described is a very, very, very normal turn 9, where your opponent just like hero powers or does something else super anti-tempo, starts drawing cards or whatever, and plays 6 tempo. And then you play all 9 tempo, and then get 2 extra tempo of advantage from like a good trade or a good removal. Like not a board clear, but just like I frostbolted a 6/3 or a 5/3. I frostbolted a 5/3, right? Because it was a 5/5 and it lost 2 health. Well, now you have the board. You've just swung the board by the effectiveness of like 5 mana, right? Like unless you were totally off the board before, you have it. You're now like back fighting for the board. So this is the kind of situation that you're always setting up. Whenever you're about to lose the board, don't think, oh crap, I'm going to lose the board. Don't think, well, I guess I'm waiting for my Psychic Scream now. Sometimes you think that if you're like really behind. But for the most part, think, what are the weird series of cards that I may draw, or that my opponents may do, or that my opponents may at any time very easily just like miss 2 tempo that will help me get back onto the board. And whichever those outs are, you play into all. And one of the outs that always exists is my opponent does not curve out. So just because you don't curve out doesn't mean your opponent has to. And that's why, for the most part, you're still templing, especially through like turn 6 at the very least. Like just because your opponent may not do everything, and then after that, they may use all their mana. But if they're drawing cards, for example, that's not a tempo play, and you're right back in it. So always keep those options open. I feel like I play with the board, I don't know, maybe 85% of the time, like on average. And that's hugely, hugely disproportionate to the amount of times I should be spending on them. And that's just because, I think I care about the board more than other people, and I think they're wrong not to care about the board as much. And you add to that I'm maybe a little bit better at trading or at anticipating than other people are, and so I get these little edges. And when the little edges build up, it's 1 stat here, 2 stats here. Eventually, they add up to 8, and you win the game.
All right. I think that's it. Those are all 3 of your categories,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So hopefully, it's a good review for people who knew this stuff, and hopefully, if you haven't heard us talk about it in this kind of like breakdown, you hear it here, because it's not anything new. We've been doing it for a very long time. Other people have been doing it for a very long time. It's just I'm trying to answer like the very nebulous question of like, why does my board look like this on this turn more often than your board, right? Like a lot of people are like, oh well, if I had that board on turn 7, I'd win too. It's like, well, have that board then more often, then you'll win more often. And it's not a very like direct answer to be able to get you to that place more often.
Yeah.
Um,
So hopefully you guys found it helpful. Like we said, nothing new. But this is where the state of the arena is nowadays. It's very board centric. So you're going to see sort of curvestone a lot, and you need to know how to deal with it, right? Um, e- Especially when you are not putting stuff out onto the board. You have to ask yourself, okay, well, is it the situation where I can still fight for the board, or do I have to go for? Do I have to try setting up for my AOE if I have one, right? Whether it's in your hand or not in your hand, and it's just risk assessment. Everything we talk about is just risk assessment, and it's just one variant of risk assessment there.
Yep. And after you have the board, we keep doing the thing where we say like, "Is this fine?" And you always like, "This is fine. This is fine," even when the opponent starts doing stuff. It's because it's within the variance. If it's within the variance that you anticipated when you were dropping your minions, given your spells that you have in your hand, then when it comes back to your turn, you can deal with it and you can still control the board, and it's fine, right? Like, if you go one step more like meta onto why do you want the board so much, besides that it turns every minion into spells, part of it's kind of the same thing, right? It puts you in control, and you want to be in control, and you want to make more decisions because that's how you show your skill relative to the opponent. So first part of the skill is setting up the scenario in which you can make more decisions and be at an advantage. The second part of that is executing your advantage. Okay. So that's deep fried meta. Getting onto the board. Hopefully that was helpful to people. And just remember, you are always on the board. If you're ever off the board, you're always getting back onto the board. Those other times when you don't get back on the board, they don't exist. If you're thinking at all about them, you're doing it wrong. Like flat out. Like you may think like, oh, that's crazy. Sometimes you just don't get on the board. I've seen you, Adwicta, not get back on the board. Yeah, but if I'm ever thinking about that, I'm doing it wrong. And if you know me, I'm usually not thinking about that unless I've given up on the game already. And I'm just like, well, sometimes you lose, right? And sometimes your opponent gets out really fast. Okay. Let's go on to the question from the goat.
All right. Question from the GOAT comes from our subreddit. It is asked by Odang. And the question is, why is Starfall rated so high? It's at a 130, which is similar to Swipe and Replicating Menace. Was it always this high? I don't play much Druid, so just trying to get a sense of its value in the current meta. So, Adukta, you are the algorithm guy. You're the stats guy. What's your thoughts on why this is so high?
It's not so high. It's been, I think at one point, maybe like many years ago, we rated Swipe significantly higher than Starfall. But for at least a year now, probably like 2 years, we rated Starfall very similar to Swipe, even as Blizzard puts them into very, very different buckets. Starfall used to be in the 5th bucket, I think, when Blizzard first bucketed it. And it was like totally silly. Right now, Starfall's in the 4th bucket. So Starfall's 135, Swipe is 140. Starfall's in the 4th bucket. Swipe is in the top half of the 1st bucket. So from Blizzard's perspective, Swipe is kind of the much better card here. But this is also something we're not like too surprised about. Starfall's around where Starfire is. Starfire is rated similarly for us as well, and they both do kind of this thing where it leans towards people who are better at the game in terms of how well you use it. Because one of the fundamental things that Starfall can do, its only redeeming factors as a removal, because otherwise it's a crappy removal. They deal 5 damage for 5 mana. That would be a pretty average card. And then a Consecration that doesn't go phase and costs 1 more mana. Probably be an above average card anyway, but still wouldn't be anything special. But the fact that starting on turn 5, this card is never a dead card. You are always going to get value out of it. For 5 mana, he's either going to play something big and then you're going to deal 5 damage to it, or he's going to play a bunch of things that are small and then you're going to Starfall. There is very little way to play around a Starfall. And what that means, like I said, is this card is playable always. Every turn you have an option to Starfall, that it is in your hand and you have 5 mana. That's not the case with so many other cards, including Swipe. Are you going to swipe something for 4? Sometimes you kind of have to, but at that point it's no better than a Starfall. And it's way less flexible. Because its alternate is to deal 1 damage to a whole bunch of them. Right? So,
yeah.
You kind of have to look at it not just in terms of what its pure output is, but in how much choice these cards give you. And one thing Swipe does have going for it that Starfall doesn't is that it can go face. So that's a really nice part about Swipe compared to Starfall. But the deal 2 damage to everything versus deal 1 damage to everything, it's not really all that close. Like, deal 2 damage to everything in Consecration is a premium card at 4 mana. Deal 1 damage to everything in Arcane Explosion for 2 mana is very much not premium. And for 1 mana, deal 1 damage to everything in the new like mage card or something. That's like good, but still not like. So there's a pretty big gap there that 1 mana more than makes up for.
All right. So thank you, Odang. That was a question from the GOAT. And if you have a question, feel free to tweet at us or just go to the Grinning Goat subreddit and ask your question there as well. I check it a decent amount, and there's a good chance your question might be featured next week.
Yeah. Question from the GOAT, also brought to you by our patrons, patreon.com/grinninggoat. Thank you guys so much for your support. Help us keep the light on. Help us keep the light on at the Lightforge. Okay. Card good bad is what we'll end this on. I like this. We're getting to like snappier podcasts. By the way, if you guys have only been with us for less than 2 years, you may not remember this, but these podcasts used to be pretty strictly limited to like 45, 50 minutes.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And then it was impossible to get them under an hour.
Yes. Even though every time before we start recording a podcast, we're like, okay, this one's going to be under an hour. Okay. So, card good bad is Damage Stegatron. I picked this card because I wanted to it's a very interesting card. We have it rated at 97, which is almost average. It is a 6 mana, I almost said 5 mana because it should be. It's a 6 mana 5/6 basic. It's actually a 5/12, but it hurts itself for 6 damage when it comes out, and it has taunt. So if you think about cards that, like, what, for 6 mana you should have a 6/7. This is a 5/6. So it basically loses 2 stats for taunt. If you think of cards that lose 2 stats for taunt, they're not that good. Like, you're getting to like Booty Bay territory here, like Lord of the Arena territory. Like, they're definitely below average cards. But this one manages to end up right around average. And it's also a mech. So I think we get a decent amount of questions about this particular card, even though it's not a terribly special. And so part of it, I just want to explain the score a little. So part of it, yes, it's a mech. That's not really that big a part of it. It also is injured, which means you can heal it with, let's say, Room Brewer, and that will end up being a pretty good combo. But again, not a big part of its score at all. It's mostly just this high because of how the stat distribution works. Because a 5/6 taunt is just like 10 points better than a 6/5 taunt for the same amount of mana. And in the same exact way that we'll work this out a little bit more with examples, but kind of in the same way where we kind of called this before it came out, and everybody's experience has matched it. Microtech Controller, the 3 mana 2/1 that summons 2 1/1 microbots, which is the Murloc Tidehunter with 1 more mana and 1 additional 1/1, really did not look intimidating when it was being released. Blizzard puts it in the 6 bucket, but we right off the bat said, oh, it's one of the best cards in the game. There's nothing special to it. It's not a huge combo card or anything. It has some minor combo considerations, it's mostly just that the stat distribution matches up very well against, like we were talking about before in Curvestone, right? Like against the possibilities that can come out. So a Microtech controller, it's too spread out for you to really effectively ping it. It knocks out 4 health. If your opponent only plays 3 health, it knocks down 3 health. Just the fact that you can't ping away most of its body in one ping makes it a huge difference from Rock. So going back to the damaged Stegatron, what you have here is 6 health, which is very important for a taunt, because not a lot of things deal 6 damage as opposed to 5 damage. And the 5 attack is very, very important to something at 6 mana, because a whole lot of things below 6 mana have 5 health. Actually, a whole lot of things at 6 mana even have 5 health. Like that 5 attack at that mana cost is just a very, very important like amount of attack to have. So if you look at Den Creeper, that's rated like 3 or something for 5 mana, 3/6 taunt, and that's already reflecting how important that 6 health is. So that's also a very understated taunt, but you know, at 90, it's like pretty draftable. And here you add the 5 attack breakpoint, and it gets significant. So there's nothing special going on here. We we looked at it a number of times. It's not being misvalued. It's that mediocre rather than terrible of a card.
Yeah, what a sexy pick this week for Card Good Bad.
That's what this meta's about. Don't go for sexy. Sexy doesn't work in this meta. I mean, depends on how sexy. You gotta go for like super sexy, right? If you're like a 10 out of 10, like you got it. You're good. You're gonna roll to 12. But if you have a choice between like a 7 and like a 5, take the 5. Take the 5 route.
Wow. Is this also life advice as well as Hearthstone advice? Or just Hearthstone anymore?
Depends on how skillful you can get with the 5 versus the 7. Like it many factors.
That's true. A lot of value in this week's podcast. But anyways, that's good. And for a lot of cards, when you're evaluating, it's not so much just about, okay, what should I get? What am I getting? It's also very meta dependent, right? Like Adwokta talked about, very meta dependent, and also how much these extra stats matter, right? It's like, yes, you're losing stats, but how much does that matter? Or for some cards, yes, I'm gaining stats, but how much does that matter, right? And a lot of times when you gain stats, it comes with a downside. So think something like Venture Co. Mercenary. You have to ask yourself, how important is this downside? And, for example, in today's meta, Venture Co. is pretty dangerous, right? Like it's good, and it can certainly win you a game or be a fine card, but it's one of those cards in which you definitely have to evaluate the effect, and in today's meta, the effect can be fairly bad. So that's good. Gives you a little bit of insight on how you evaluate cards as well.
Yeah. If you're wondering, like, how do we know that 6 health is so important on turn 6? How do we know 5 attack is so important on turn 5? We're not doing any of these with our heads anymore. This is all algorithmically determined by the available card pool and their attacks and health around that amount of mana, as well as the ability to piece together cards to play on turn 5 and 6, what percent chance each of them happens, and how this card matches up against all of those possible options. So a lot of stuff that we can't really do in our heads, but our experiences match up with. You talk to anybody, you're like, right now, how important is 5 damage? People will be like, pretty important. Like, definitely one of those breakpoint kind of stuff. How important is 6 health compared to like 5 health? And they're like, 5 health is important, 6 health is important too. And they're like, how important is 7 health? And they're like, not so much. Like, a lot less important. And the algorithm picks up on that. Okay, so I think that's it for today's Lightforge. We will see you guys. Oh, so Merps is going to be gone for the next 2 Lightforges, which means we're recording on Thursday night, both of them. One of them is going to be more on point. Hopefully, we're fingers crossed hoping that Blizzard updates the buckets this week. And so we'll talk about that if that happens. And if that does not happen, we'll just treat it like any other delayed podcast. And the other one will be another podcast similar to this one, where we talk about some topic that is fundamental to the game of Hearthstone Arena itself. and will hopefully help you like substantively do better in the arena after listening to the podcast, because we know it's an adjustment to make. We're used to it because we started from this, but especially if you did not start playing arena until it was already standard, like if you never played wild arena before, then you don't know, because wild arena standard arena came in at the same time as the spell and weapon bonus, which was set at way too high, which has stayed the entire way through. And that's for the most part. It's not the bucketing that's caused this thing. Bucketing kind of made it a little worse, because they adjusted everyone's quality up. But fundamentally, the meta shift happened more than a year and a half ago. When they rolled out 7.1, and they made arena standard, and they added a weapon and spell offering, which had not existed before that, and that just kind of changed arena. And that rolled into Ngoro, which had all these overpowered high initiative like neutral cards, and it kind of degraded from there. So now we're back, and it's a very different style of arena now than it.
All right, I think that's it for us this week. Once again, we are recording on Thursday, and enjoy your next 2 weeks essentially with Adwicta.
And if you're watching the stream, the Monday streams are going to be canceled. Not this Monday, because Merps isn't gone until the latter half of the week, but the 2 Mondays after that will be canceled. All right. So until, I guess not next week, until Thursday or Friday. See you guys. This is Adwicta.
This is Merps. Bye.